Good? Perfect. All right, we are all set. Well, hello everyone. Good evening. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you tonight. Sounds like Cindy did a lot of research, so good job with that. Hopefully I can educate you guys a little bit more on that. But like they said, my name is Nathan Wagner. I'm a graduate student at Grand Valley State University, getting my master's degree in biology currently. I'm working with Dr. Ali Locker. Dr. Michael Lombardo is on my committee, and Dr. Priscilla Nyamai is also on my committee. So those three are a great influence and a great help for all the work that I've been doing so far. So a little background about me. I grew up always interested in nature. I hunted and fished all growing up, was in Boy Scouts, just loved being outside in any capacity I could be outside in. And wasn't until college that I discovered my love for birds. So on a whim, I took ornithology to fulfill an animal class credit, and realized that I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed learning about birds and going out and seeing them and seeing all the interactions they have with the nature and the habitat that they're found in. So I ended up my sophomore year, the summer after my sophomore year, I should say, doing research with Dr. Lombardo with his tree swallows, and that kind of got me hooked really into ornithology as a profession. Since then, I've done a few other projects with Dr. Lombardo, kind of working on writing a manuscript. I've done some research on some other invasive species in Michigan with my current committee chair, Ali Locker, and all of that has led me to what I'm doing now, which is looking at the effects of Hemlock Woolly Adelgid infestation on avian assemblages and forest structure. So this is the majority of what my thesis entails. I also have another smaller section, but I'll be focusing just on this today. So a little bit of background. Eastern hemlocks are one of the longest living, slowest growing, and most shade-tolerant trees in eastern North America. They can take as long as 250 to 300 years to reach maturity and can live to up to 800 years, so a very slow-growing and long-living species. Hemlocks can grow in quite a wide variety of habitats, anywhere from soils that are very moist but well-drained to very dry, sandy soils. They have a wide geographic distribution, which you can see on that map on the top right there. So that kind of shows the density of hemlocks and where they're found. So brown is pretty sparse, and then as you get closer to a dark green, that means hemlocks are dense in that area, and then it's outlined their whole distribution there. They grow in a wide variety of elevations too, anywhere from the bottom of ravines to the top of cliffs, all throughout the Appalachian mountain range and beyond. So they have a pretty wide distribution. They're often considered a foundation species, which basically means that they have an influence on what other species can be found in the habitats that they grow in. And they do that in a variety of ways. The biggest is through shading. So if you notice this picture here on the bottom left, that shows the needles of what a hemlock tree are. They're pretty wide for a conifer species. A lot of other conifer species have really narrow, thin needles, but hemlocks have much wider needles that are kind of rounded at the end. They're also pretty scraggly and tend to hang out in the understory a lot more than other coniferous species. What that allows them to do is shade the areas underneath them very well, which does a few things. One is it raises soil moisture content while also lowering soil temperature. And that essentially means that it weeds out, if you will, certain species that require lower temperature or higher temperatures and lower moisture. So that way they're able to influence a lot of species that grow around them. They also have an influence on a lot of hydrology. Their roots often help stabilize cliff banks and things like that along waterways. And they do the same shading over a lot of bodies of water, which again lowers water temperature, which allows for more dissolved oxygen to be found in the water, basically it's good for almost every aquatic species to have more oxygen in the water, right? Hemlocks also provide excellent cover and food for a wide variety of mammals, birds, and other animals. Roughly 140 mammals and birds are considered hemlock associates. We'll get into that in a little bit more in a little bit. Unfortunately, hemlocks don't have the best reproductive strategy in the world. They produce a large quantity of cones and seeds for much of their life, but usually less than 25% of those seeds that they produce are germinative. So essentially they're wasting a lot of their own energy and time producing seeds that will never be able to grow. Now, those seeds that aren't able to grow do provide some food source for a lot of birds that feed upon them, but that low germination rate just means that they can't replace dead and dying hemlocks very well. That combined with usually shallow roots and pretty thin bark means that they're also pretty susceptible to a lot of invasions and disease. Now, of those animals that are associated with hemlocks, roughly 140 to 145, something like that, we see that around 96 bird species specifically are associated with hemlocks as well. At least 8 of those species are considered strongly associated or hemlock dependent. Now, among these hemlock-dependent species, we see birds like the Acadian flycatcher, black-burnian warbler, blue-headed vireo, black and white warbler, black-throated green and black-throated blue warblers, ovenbirds, and winter wrens, and a few other species that are often considered hemlock obligates or hemlock-dependent. Most of these species require hemlocks for nesting sites. They also get food as a source of that, but that's not the real driving source for them being dependent on hemlocks. It's mostly for nesting. And of these species, the Acadian flycatcher has been found time and time again to be the most strongly hemlock-dependent bird species. Now, a little bit on Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. So Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, or HWA, which is probably how you'll hear me say it a lot tonight. It's not as much of a mouthful. It's a small aphid-like insect that is named for the waxy wool-like coating it produces, and it uses that coating to protect itself both from predators and to help insulate it during the winter. That coating also kind of helps hold it to the tree once it's found a home to stick to. In its native range of Japan, HWA feeds on various species of hemlocks and spruces, and it also has a few insect predators that help keep its population in check. The species that it feeds upon in Japan also have an immunity, a built-up resistance, if you will, to HWA after having been exposed to it for so long, so that the impacts of HWA aren't as severe on those species found in Japan. HWA was transferred to the United States somewhere around Richmond, Virginia in 1951, likely as just an accidental group that came over on international shipping, something like that. So it's been here for quite a while, but we haven't seen it in Michigan until recently. In the Eastern United States and Eastern North America as a whole, HWA targets Carolina and Eastern Hemlock. We don't have Carolina hemlock around here. That's more of a southern species. And that population is actually doing even worse than Eastern Hemlock is doing. Interestingly enough, on the west coast of America, we have the Western Hemlock, which somehow, even though not being exposed to HWA for nearly as long as these Japanese species have been, has an immunity to HWA. So it's thought that Western hemlock is more closely related to the Japanese species of hemlock than Eastern and Carolina hemlock are. So they have an incredibly unusual and confusing life cycle. What makes it even more interesting is that their life cycle is different between the United States and Japan. So in Japan, so their native range, adelgids come in both male and female variants. Both are needed to produce eggs. Those eggs are laid temporarily on spruce trees. Then once those eggs hatch into a crawler stage, they're transferred to hemlock trees. So they kind of have an intermediate host there. In Japan too, the male adelgids can fly while females cannot. So they spend most of their life just flying around trying to find females to breed with. It's thought that in the United States, adelgids that were introduced were either just one single adelgid or a very small group of female-only adelgids, because we have not found evidence of any male HWA in the United States or anywhere else in its invasive range. Meaning that these females use what's called parthenogenesis to reproduce. Essentially, they just found a way, life finds a way, Jurassic Park, right? They found a way to be able to reproduce without needing males. So these females in the US are able to produce eggs without males. They don't need to be fertilized. They're just basically cloning themselves as much as they possibly can, which is part of the reason why we're having such an issue with controlling the populations. In the US, the adelgids have 2 generations that are produced per year. So usually we'll see a group of eggs being laid somewhere in mid to late July. Those eggs eventually hatch, and then they take quite a little bit to reach maturity, which includes overwintering before they're able to reproduce. Once those individuals that are recently hatched have reached maturity and gone through winter, they are then able to produce a new batch or a new generation of HWA sometime around March. So right around now we have adelgids producing eggs, or maybe even a month ago or so. Adelgids can also live for a while, so if you imagine having one individual that can lay 2 generations per year times by billions of these insects that are here, it's probably kind of easier to understand why it spreads so quickly. So kind of like I alluded to, we'll have the eggs laid either in July or in March. The insect will hatch into what's called the crawler stage. And usually it's found in the crawler stage from somewhere like 3 to 5 days, in that range. So a pretty short period of time. And that's when almost all of the movement happens for this species. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But once in the crawler stage, and once these crawlers have been moved to wherever their new home is going to be, they'll find where the needle connects to the tree, on a hemlock tree specifically. We haven't found any HWA on any other conifer species, which is good for now. Hopefully that doesn't come in the future. But they'll find where that needle connects to the branch and insert these stylets into it. So if I go back here, you'll see just how small these insects are, right? Usually less than a millimeter in length. But they have those incredibly long stylets, which are sometimes quadruple the size of their body length, that they'll then insert into the base of that needle. And if you look here in this electron microscope image, you can actually see the adelgid up here and then those tendrils reaching way, way down into the tree. And those tendrils do a couple things. So one, it helps them anchor to the branch. That, combined with the waxy coating that they're producing on themselves, really anchors it into the tree. They also use those tendrils for feeding, as you probably have expected, right? So once you get a bunch of adelgids on a tree, usually it happens pretty quickly. Once one arrives, there's usually a lot more relatively soon afterward. They all attach, They stay there for their whole life, just feeding exclusively on that one tree. While they're feeding, they also inject a toxic spittle into the tree, which helps break down cells, which eventually lets more nutrients out of the tree for them to feed upon, right? Once a tree becomes infested, it can die in as little as 4 to 10 years. So it's a relatively quick process and pretty quick death that we're seeing in a lot of these trees. Now, HWA can be spread in a variety of ways. One of the most common is just with wind, right? So they're in that crawler stage for 3 to 5 days, usually. A very strong gust of wind, or even not so strong a gust of wind, can easily blow them from one tree to another. But we also have evidence for other animals and humans transporting them. The issue with that is that usually those distances are much farther than just wind throw. And birds have actually been cited multiple times in literature as being one of the ways that HWA is spread the easiest and the farthest. We see quite a range of that spread rate throughout the United States and now up into Quebec a little bit. Anywhere from 7.6 to 30 kilometers per hour is generally 30 kilometers per year is generally the accepted rate at which these adelgids are able to spread. It's worth noting, though, that they spread faster in the south than they do in the north, and that's because they're susceptible to extreme cold temperatures. So usually if you have multiple days in a row that are under 10 to 15 degrees below zero, we'll start to see a die-off of adelgids. But it has to be multiple days in a row. And as you might have seen recently, that's becoming a little bit more unpredictable with climate change, which has allowed HWA to spread farther north than what was originally thought possible. And it is expected that by 2050, we'll find HWA in the entirety of Eastern Hemlock's native range. This map here is showing the current extent, I think, as of 2018 of HWA. So everywhere that's outlined in that gray color is where HWA is currently found, and then the green, again, is that distribution of Eastern Hemlock. So as you can see, it has been found in Michigan, which we'll get into here right now. So HWA was thought to be spread to Michigan somewhere around 2015. We're not exactly sure when. There was an early invasion that happened somewhere in the late 2000s that got under control relatively quickly. We thought it was gone. And then sometime around 2015, 2016, we found it again. So it's here probably to stay for now, despite a lot of management efforts that are currently going into treating HWA around here. So why did I choose Michigan? One, because I live here. But two, Michigan provides a pretty unique study area for HWA, Eastern Hemlocks, and the birds associated with these species for a few different reasons. If I go back to this slide here, you'll see that the Michigan population and density of Eastern Hemlock is pretty sparse, especially around this area, right? We also have a pretty disjunct population, meaning that our Eastern Hemlocks aren't very well connected to the rest of the population, mostly because we're in a peninsula, right? So there's not a whole lot of Eastern Hemlock south of us, at least not directly south of us. We have a lot to the east, southeast, and some way over into Minnesota, but our Eastern Hemlock populations aren't really mixing well with them. So that's one reason why, coupled with the sparse density of Eastern Hemlocks that we see here. Michigan was also recently infested with HWA. It's the most recent state to have become infested. So that provides another kind of unique aspect for study with my project here. We also, around this area at least, and most of the west coast of Michigan, have freshwater coastal dunes, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. But those ecosystems aren't found in really any other state besides maybe a little bit in Indiana, right? So that's kind of a unique habitat that we don't find in many other states and in the other areas where HWA research has been conducted. So all of that background has led me to a few goals and questions that I had specifically for my thesis project. The first of which is, what is the effect of HWA here in West Michigan broadly? How does that affect forest structure or forest overstory structure? And how are birds affected by HWA here? I was also curious to know if we had hemlock-dependent birds here in Michigan. I know we have them, but whether or not they were actually dependent on on Eastern Hemlock here kind of remained to be seen. To date, there is no published study of HWA research or Eastern Hemlock research associated with birds, at least, in Michigan. So this is kind of a new area of study. And kind of like what I mentioned before, we have a unique population of Eastern Hemlock here, which means that the birds might not behave as they do in the majority of Eastern Hemlock's range, right? Where hemlock populations are a lot more dense or more closely related to one another. So my project consisted of a few different aspects, right? So my study area was specifically in Ottawa and Muskegon counties. I selected six public parks in those two counties, three of which were parks that had the known presence of Eastern Hemlock, and three of those parks did not have any measurable amount of Eastern Hemlock within them. So those hemlock sites are North Ottawa Dunes County Park, a section of Muskegon State Park, and Hoffmaster State Park. And then those non-hemlock sites are Ottawa Sands County Park, a different section of Muskegon State Park, and then Mosquito Creek Trails, which is way up there in the top right, which is kind of like a bike trail in Muskegon County. So those were the six parks I used. All of them were between 20 to 100 hectares, so relatively comparable in size. And again, they were selected based on the presence or absence of Eastern Hemlock. Within all of these parks, I used a mapping software to generate random points within them to eliminate any bias. So in each park, I generated 20 random points that were at least 20 meters away from each other, meaning that these random points were not independent, which I'll get into why that's important in a little bit. The parks themselves were independent. They were at least 500 meters away from one another, which basically means I wasn't very worried about birds quickly hopping from one park to the next. So we didn't have crossover there. Now, after I generated these random points, I took a GPS out into the field and went around and analyzed all of the points to make sure that they were easily accessible. So for instance, if it was on the top of a large dune, I would have gotten rid of those points to make sure that when I was not destroying any ecosystem, I could actually get to the point and so on. So after I did that, I was left with 15 to 20 points per site. Those points that I eliminated were not replicated or replaced. At each of those points, from the last week of April last year to the first week of June, I conducted point counts. So at each point, I would visit one park per day. At each point, I would stay there for 10 minutes, listening to all of the birds that I could hear or see and recording them. I only recorded birds in the order Passeriformes, so songbirds, because some literature kind of goes back and forth on whether point counts are an adequate measure of the populations of other families of birds. So I only looked at birds in order Passeriformes, so those songbirds. That unlimited radius means if I heard the bird, I recorded it. Now, I mentioned before that these points were not independent. So I only recorded what species I heard, not the number of species, or not the number of individuals. Okay. Then later in the summer, I returned to those points and conducted vegetation surveys of the overstory only. So I set up 0.04 hectare plots, which is essentially a circular plot that has a radius of 37 feet. So I'd stick a stake in the ground, take my meter tape, go out to 37 feet, walk in a big circle, and any tree that was within that circle got recorded. And with that, I recorded the species, the diameter at breast height, which is the generally accepted way of assessing the size of a tree, and then the height of that tree as well. I also, for trees that did not, or for tree species that did not fall within a certain category, so anything that was smaller than 3 inches at breast height, I recorded as advanced regeneration. So basically, all of the seedlings and saplings were compiled into one group just to make it easier for data analysis later. So these two graphs are the results that I found from the forest overstory. And again, I only recorded overstory species. That's kind of due to budgetary constraints and time constraints. I wouldn't have had time to do an analysis of all the understory species as well. So hopefully that's a project for a future graduate student. But we see that in these graphs, the composition of forests is pretty similar. So we have a lot of the same species. These graphs are showing the diameter at breast height, which is on that bottom x-axis, by basal area, so the size or the amount of space taken up by a tree. And essentially what this is showing is the age structure of a forest. So, for example, if we look at these non-hemlock species, we'll see that a lot of them are kind of in this intermediate age range, which is what DBH is basically showing us. We're kind of using that as a proxy for age. And the hemlock forests are a little bit more unpredictable with that structure there. So like I said, the composition is similar, so we see a lot of the same species, but the structure differs a little bit, meaning that in hemlock forests, we obviously have hemlocks present, right? We also see significantly declined presence of oak species in hemlock forests. Why that is, I don't really know yet. And in these hemlock stands, we also see a lot of maple and beech kind of taking the place of those oaks that are gone, right? Oh, and I did forget to mention, I also recorded the canopy cover at each of these sites. So basically, I would take a picture of the forest canopy, use a software program that would analyze whatever percentage of the pixels were taken up by leaves, and then open space to determine how dense the cover was, and found that the hemlock forest canopy had a significantly higher canopy cover, which we expected with that shading. Now, this is showing the number of seedlings and saplings per acre of each of the species that I recorded. So those hemlock forests are on the left, and then non-hemlock forests are on the right. The important thing to note here is that hemlocks in our area are not doing well, which we expected with their not great reproductive cycle, right? I found roughly 2 seedlings per acre across all of the sites, which is dramatically lower than everything else. In our hemlock forests, we're also seeing a lot more beech and maple seedlings than we're seeing in non-hemlock forests. That could potentially indicate that there's a shift, or there will be a shift coming to have beech and maple be more dominant in these forests throughout time. Whereas those non-hemlock sites, we see a lot more oaks, almost exclusively oak and sassafras seedlings in those sites. And I'll get into the beech and maple significance in a little bit. So I know the part you're more interested in. I found 65 bird species just in the order Passeriformes. So again, just songbirds throughout my all of my point counts. A lot of frequent flyers, pun fully intended, of species that you probably see all the time, right? A lot of robins, wood thrushes, species like that were very frequently found. There are also a lot of migrants in here, right? So probably 10 to 15 species were seen fewer than 5 times. So their contribution to the forest as a whole isn't very significant, but it does still impact it a little bit. And of the hemlock dependents that I listed earlier, basically all of them were found in both sites except for the Acadian flycatcher, which was found only in hemlock sites. Now, we found 2 unique groups between hemlock and non-hemlock forests. So the avian assemblage in hemlock forests is different than the avian assemblage in non-hemlock forests, which is pretty cool and interesting. We weren't sure if that would hold up here because, again, our unique hemlock structure and such. So essentially what this graph is showing are the data for my bird point counts. And basically the only thing that you need to look at is where those ellipses are placed. So we can see that they're 2 separate ellipses. This statistical analysis basically just detects if there's a difference between groups. So those red points are the hemlock forests, the black ones are the non-hemlock, so you can kind of see in those points a little bit to a distribution. Unfortunately, I can't say what's driving that difference. Another statistical analysis that I used looked at the vegetation structure that I recorded and compared that to the avian structure, and found that none of the vegetation variables I had collected influenced significantly the avian community. What that likely means is that the understory is a lot more impactful for birds in general, which also was kind of expected, and leaves a great opportunity for future study. I know this is kind of hard to read and a little far away, but these are all of the bird species that I recorded this summer, just listed in alphabetical order. The species that I have highlighted and bolded are the ones that were listed as driving the result of that graph with the ellipses more. So those are the ones that seem to be driving the difference between hemlock and non-hemlock forests. Interestingly, most of the ones that are highlighted are not hemlock associates or hemlock dependent. So especially like red-winged blackbird, we know that's a marsh species. Baltimore oriole, pine warbler, and wood thrush. Wood thrush are a little bit more hemlock associated than the other ones. Ovenbirds are generally hemlock associates, but Baltimore orioles and pine warblers usually are not listed as being hemlock associated or hemlock avoidant. So their influence in that result is still kind of unknown and something I'm kind of working through right now. But again, 65 species and those bolded ones seemed to have the most impact on the results I got. Some conclusions from this. We know that Eastern hemlock is important, even in this area where we have kind of a unique distribution and unique ecosystem surrounding Eastern hemlocks. We know that hemlocks still influence the bird species here. Like I mentioned, Acadian flycatchers were the only species that I recorded exclusively in hemlock forests. But regardless of that, that bird still needs a home, right? So even if it's just to Acadian flycatchers, they're still important. But we know that that's not the case, right? We still see those 2 unique ecosystems or unique bird assemblages between hemlock and non-hemlock forests. We also see that the forest structure is probably changing, right? I kind of mentioned that beech and maple species are starting to take the place of oaks, which may not be that big of a deal, but a lot of times when we see that pattern happening, we have something occur called mesophication. And basically that means that these beeches and maples will take over an ecosystem, and because of the shape of their leaves and the amount of shade they give off, they are able to kind of push down the regeneration of other species, most specifically oaks. So once maple and pine in oak populations. And a lot of that has to do with kind of like fire dependency in species. So oaks are a fire dependent species. They need to be burned every once in a while. Beeches and maples are strongly not fire dependent, right? They do not like fire. They do not do well with it. And because of that, they have a leaf shape that when their leaves fall, they're very flat. They compress a lot, which means there's not a lot of oxygen for fire to burn, so on. We don't have that many wildfires in this area anymore, and not a whole lot of controlled burns either. So whether that will impact bird species or the forest structure as a whole kind of remains to be seen. And that leaves us with what's next, right? There's still a ton of research that a lot of people all throughout the United States and Canada are working on to look into the effects of HWA, how to slow it down, what treatments are available, what things work best to slow the spread of HWA. We also see a lot of community events going on, even with just observing HWA in general. There are a ton of different organizations that love to get data from whoever they can to report and record where HWA is found. So if you're out in the woods and you flip over the underside of a hemlock tree and see all those little white dots on it, that's HWA, and you can record it and report it to various state agencies. So the DNR, the Michigan DNR, has a website where you can report it. The Ottawa Conservation District also records that data, and they like to be made aware of new occurrences of HWA. And West Michigan SISMA, which is the Cooperative Invasive Species Management Association, they also have a website where you can report HWA sightings. So basically, if you go on Google and search where to report an HWA sighting, hopefully one of those several will pop up, and you'll be able to report that if you so choose. Here are a boatload of references that I used for this, and I would love to take any questions if you have any.
I have two.
Yeah.
One, is there any known predator of the HWA?
Not in its introduced range. There are two insect predators in Japan, and there's actually been some research conducted in New Hampshire, I believe, where they are taking that predator insect from Japan and introducing it to the US. In Japan, that specific beetle, there's two beetles mostly that feed on HWA. One of them feeds exclusively on HWA, which is the one they introduced here in hopes that that would help slow or mitigate some of the damage done by HWA. But there are potential consequences to that being done, right? There's the potential for that insect, that beetle, to start feeding upon other insects that it didn't occur with in its native range, right?
And then my second question is, I'm just rambling around your comments about the oak population.
Yeah.
Because in my reading, that species of tree in Doug Tallamy and some other sources says that it hosts more, like 300 species of caterpillars and other insects that are important to birds and other wildlife. And I'm wondering, the difference between where this is found in the hemlocks, and if whatever is taking out the oak population in those hemlock woods could cause a lot more damage than just the beeches and maples taking over.
Yes, it could. It definitely could. As far as I know right now, the shift towards beech and maple isn't a super high priority on the list of things to be watching for from a lot of state agencies. But there is the chance that that will influence bird populations, insect populations, and things like that. But there's not a whole lot of research being done in that area right now, so the extent of that, I'm not sure. I can't talk on that a whole lot. But yeah, it could definitely have an impact on some of the bird species you're seeing. Yeah?
What times of year would we expect to be able to find the woolly evidence?
You can find it almost any time. It'll be easier to see anytime there's not snow, really. So basically, usually you'll find them on the underside of Eastern Hemlock branches. So if you just flip a few branches over and see a bunch of them, you'll know. But they can be found throughout the season because hemlocks don't lose their needles. They're a conifer. You can still find them in the winter. Yep. Yeah.
You mentioned that you were finding an average of only 2 seedlings per acre on the hemlocks, and I wondered, one, how does that compare to seedlings of other species, and 2, did you consider that that might be an effect of overbrowsing?
Yes, so I will go back here. So all of these other species, so we'll take maples, for example. Hemlocks are way down here. Maples, we have an average of 150 seedlings per acre in hemlock forests. Beech are getting close to 250 seedlings per acre. Oaks are somewhere down around 80 or so. Pine is probably 90, 95, something like that. So comparatively, it's very low. Could it be an effect of overbrowsing? Definitely. I have no way of telling whether that's exclusively from hemlocks just not reproducing well or being overbrowsed, but deer love to eat small hemlocks, right? So that could definitely be an issue with that too. Yeah. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, a couple. As humans transferring these around, is it mostly going to be on your feet because you walk somewhere where they were? Are they? I mean, because these things are everywhere.
Right.
When we decide to go for a walk in Muskegon State Park, what do you do when you get back to your property so that you aren't carrying these things?
Right. Yeah. The best thing that I know, or the best recommendation I have, is to not go from one hemlock forest straight to the next. Usually if you just wash your clothes in between, or if you want to go somewhere else, bring a different sweatshirt or something like that to switch into. Washing just in a normal washing machine will kill HWA, so you don't have to worry about that. I haven't seen a whole lot about it clinging to shoes or anything like that, but I do know in like highly trafficked areas, so like the Appalachian Trail, for example, humans have had a significant impact with them latching on their backpacks and clothes and things like that. They don't have extra changes of clothes really, so they're able to spread them a long distance too. But my best recommendation is to not go from one forest. If you know there's hemlocks there, straight to another. Just wash clothes in between or bring an extra set. Yep.
And then we were walking in Duncan Woods today, and all the hemlocks are tagged. And that's hundreds of hemlocks. So does that mean that they're being treated, or are they being tracked somehow?
Yes.
What is the treat?
So several parks around the area actually have tags like that. So Duncan Woods is a great example of one. North Ottawa Dunes, all of the hemlocks there are also tagged. I believe a lot of that is done by the Ottawa Conservation District, which they're actively treating for HWA in the properties that they own, and in Ottawa County, the Ottawa County Park System. They treat with a chemical called imidacloprid. So basically they have to drill into the tree, use a large syringe to inject this chemical into there. And it's basically a systemic insecticide. So it spreads throughout the entire tree. The tree holds on to that for probably 2 to 3 years in that range, which kills any adelgids that are currently on it and prevents reinfestation. As you can imagine, that's incredibly cost ineffective. We have thousands of hemlock trees around here, and everyone has to be individually treated. There's no chemical so far that can just be thrown on the ground around them or anything like that. It has to be a systemic one because of the way adelgids feed. So it's very costly to do, but I know Duncan Woods are being treated and North Ottawa Dunes are being treated as well. Hoffmaster, yes. I know the DNR is not treating some of their state parks currently. So Muskegon State Park is not being treated as far as I know, but Hoffmaster State Park is. So the control of it is it's not great right now because it's so costly, mostly. Yeah?
And I think my trees have more scale on them. I don't know. It didn't look quite like this woolly stuff. But they said there was a liquid they could pour around the roots. Do you feel that's effective? I only have like 7 really large.
Yeah, from what I have read personally, I don't know that I could speak on the effectiveness of it very much. I know imidacloprid is the preferred method, so that injection into the trunk. The chemical that they're planning on spreading around the roots may be better for other species of insects that feed upon trees, or for whatever disease it might have. I wish I could give you more than that. Yeah, I just can't say for sure. Sure.
So you say maybe 4 to 7 years they could die if it was infected. Is that what you normally would look for then? It's hard to lift trees, look underneath and look at the needles. So
Right.
Is there something that you could see that you could tell it's dying right away by being stressed out?
Yeah, so usually what we'll see, if you don't have time to go check every tree, which most agencies do not, is you'll start to see damage at the crown of the tree first, so a lot of browning of those trees, and then eventually that will spread down the rest of the tree. But usually the crown is the most impacted first, so the very top of the tree. Yeah.
So would injection then at that point help the tree?
It could. Yeah, it could. It depends on how much damage has been done already. Some trees are too far gone at a certain point to be worth injecting, but a lot of the ones that have just a little browning or not much at all will still be treated. Yeah.
Can we privately get a hold of somebody who would inject our trees? You only have, I have 7.
I don't know, honestly. Probably, I would imagine you could. I don't have any recommendations for anyone. Yeah.
I think it's Seisma.
Okay.
I could look it up and share it with you. Somebody came out and assessed, we only have about 7 to 9.
Right.
And assessed our trees and felt that they would benefit from a treatment, even though they look like they're on their way out and they're coming.
Was it an injection? that
They haven't done it yet, but I assume that's what they're gonna do.
If it's for HWA, most likely. Yeah.
It is.
Does that chemical just target HWA, or does it kill off other insects?
As far as I know, it's mostly directed at HWA, but there's probably impacts on other insects too. Yeah. Yeah, Dr. Lombardo.
Yeah, I was interested in the transition from oak to beech maple and long-term consequences of that, because of all the animals that depend on acorns.
Right.
Animals that depend on those animals and so on down the line.
Yeah, it could definitely have an impact on other species. So a lot of mammals feed on acorns and things like that. There's the potential for a decrease in species that rely on oaks for food or nesting material or habitat. Beech and maple still provide food and cover for a lot of species. There are a lot of generalist species that are perfectly okay with that shift, but a lot of the animals that we see that require oaks or feed heavily on acorns could be impacted. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
I'm interested in how you said the tags, or the trees are tagged.
Yes.
I see a lot of trees at Hoffmaster.
The blue paint.
The pink.
Yeah, well, some of it's blue, some of it's pink. I don't
Do you know
know
what
that means.
the blue means, the pink means, and some of them are girdled.
Yeah, I don't.
Girdling is for the oak wilt.
Yeah,
I was
yep.
talking to the ranger. So if they can't go and clear out all of them, so if they girdle it, evidently the oak wilt won't spread through the roots.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. The color system, I don't know for sure. My assumption is that when it's spray painted pink, that means it has been treated. But I don't know for sure. That could mean it's known to be infested. I don't know. But all of the trees that are tagged, they have a database. And like I said, I think it's the Ottawa Conservation District that does most of that work. They have a database of all of those trees. They just kind of keep tabs on all of them. If one's infested, they'll mark that down. If it's dead, if it's treated, that sort of thing. So it makes it easier for management purposes. Yeah.
Did they have any idea, I mean, I know the wind fluctuates and everything, but the extent of, like, the wind transfer of the little cutters?
Wind is by far the number one way that is spread.
But it's more adjacent trees, it's not
Right.
like, okay, we have our usual 40-mile-an-hour gust and it's
Right.
blow, kilometer down the road or something.
Yeah, as far as I know, I think I'm trying to remember back to some of the publications I've read. I think somewhere between 30 and 50 meters is like the farthest wind will usually transfer an adelgid. Now, when we're looking at the range as a whole where adelgids have been found, most of the ways that it's gotten farther away from there are from birds. Besides wind, they're the number 2 transporter of HWA. So they fall on the backs of birds and are transported that way. But yeah, wind does have an impact locally. Mostly animals are doing the larger spreading. The Michigan population of HWA is thought to have come from infested nursery stock, actually. So that's human caused. We probably got a shipment from one of the East Coast states of Eastern Hemlocks they thought was clean and was not. So that's kind of what they think as of right now is how it got here.
It seems like there's a moratorium on that. I'm trying to purchase some hemlocks. They're not selling in this area for good reason.
Right, yeah, it is hard to find hemlock seedlings right now because I think the hope is that if HWA is found in an area, that if and when it clears out the hemlocks, that maybe we'll be able to go back through and replant some of them that have been killed with the hope of it not being reinfested. But yeah, it's pretty difficult to find seedlings and saplings to buy right now. Dr. Lombardo?
So early on, you said that they think that the initial inoculation would be one or just very few
Yes.
females. And it's only one female, so these things are all pretty close to being genetically identical.
Yes.
So the only saving grace of that is if there's some sort of disease that they're not resistant to.
Right. Yeah, there's very little genetic diversity in the population we have in North America. So yeah, like you said, maybe a disease will come along to wipe out a lot of the population. As far as I know, there hasn't been one yet. We've kind of been relying on very cold winters to at least keep them out of the north as best as possible. But like I mentioned before, that's not doing the as good of a job as we thought it would. Yeah.
Do you have any idea how long the organism can live on not on a host, but on a mammal or a bird or a person? So what I'm thinking is I'm envisioning all these juncos in and out of my hemlocks because they love them. It's just great cover, but they're covered in Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. So how long can Hemlock Woolly Adelgid live on a juncos or a kinglets or
Yeah.
Or in a
pine
jar.
cis-
So I can't say for sure because I actually haven't read a lot about it. The best I can give you is that when they're in that crawler stage, so that 3 to 5 day period, they're fine to not be on a tree. Once they get placed on a tree, they're there. Like that's the end of the line for them. They'll be there until they're killed or the tree's dead. So whether or not they can hold on to a bird for 3 to 5 days is kind of the question to ask. I would assume they can't for very long, but there's certainly a possibility that they're hitching a ride for a couple days. Yeah.
And that only happens twice a year.
Right. Yeah.
Two hatches.
Yes. Yep.
So we would be past it now, like in the summertime.
Right.
Like you said, July.
Yeah. So usually in July and then somewhere around March. So we probably just passed the heaviest transmission period. But yeah. Yep.
significantly impact the Acadian flycatcher population?
It could. A lot of the research that has been done on birds so far, I think I mentioned this earlier, but has been done in like the eastern U.S. And so the population, the density and distribution of hemlocks there is different than here. So they're very dense. Most of their forests, especially in the Appalachian range, that's all hemlock trees for the most part. So if a majority or a lot of those trees die, the Acadian flycatcher doesn't really have anywhere else to go but north. Whether or not they can adapt to not having eastern hemlocks remains to be seen. But from the research I've read so far, sites that have been heavily infested and have had large eastern hemlock die-offs, they don't really have Acadian flycatchers there anymore. Yeah, so their outlook is a little dismal right now. Yes?
Do you know if they prefer seedlings versus mid-growth trees? Or?
If HWA does?
Yeah.
I don't think they have a preference from what I've seen. They're going to be able to get more resources from a more mature tree, and it's more likely that a bird will use that or somebody will brush into a larger tree. But I definitely wouldn't say that they can't grow on seedlings or saplings.
Let's thank Nathan for a very interesting talk.
Thank you very much.